This week's episode is brought to you by Ecolab. Looking to lower production costs without compromising quality? Purolite purification resins from Ecolab Life Sciences offer unmatched performance with uniquely uniform beads for consistent results every time. Plus, with dual contingent supply, you get supply chain security you can count on. Discover the power of Purolite resins at puroliteresins.com/ecolab. That's PUROLITERESINS.com/ECOLAB.
Welcome back to the Business of Biotech. I'm your host, Ben Comer, Chief Editor at Life Science Leader, and today I'm thrilled to speak with Tom Wells, Director of Life Sciences at 4C Associates, about procurement practices, an issue that can stymie promising biotech companies during critical growth and development stages if not done correctly. Tom has worked in a variety of procurement roles at companies including Novartis, Takeda, and most recently, BMS before joining 4C Associates, a London-based commercial supply chain and operations consultancy. Tom is passionate about procurement and the ways it can impact a growing biotech business, and I'm looking forward to learning more along with our Business of Biotech listeners about how procurement can make or break biotech. Tom, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure to be here.
I mentioned in the introduction that you are passionate about procurement, an issue that can be overlooked or undermanaged by growing companies, despite its importance. Why did you decide to spend the bulk of your career on procurement issues, and how did you get started in it initially?
Well, I actually started from university. I read botany at university, or plant science, and then went into marketing. First of all, for a wine and spirit retail company in the UK, then moved to H.J. Heinz, the food company, as a brand manager. And from there, went to various different marketing and communications agencies based in London, before moving back in-house with Electrolux, the white goods company. First of all, as head of corporate comms for Western Europe, and then as head of brand PR worldwide. And it was in that job that I really came across procurement for the first time. And up to that point, my view probably would have been that procurement are those annoying people who upset agencies, get contracts wrong, bungle payments, and generally get in the way and slow things down. But I was asked to help work on an internal campaign to reposition procurement in the eyes of the business, and help people understand what procurement is and what it actually does.
And which company was, I'm sorry, Tom, which company was that?
This was Electrolux,
Okay.
based in Sweden. And the program was all about repositioning procurement in the eyes of the business, in the eyes of suppliers, trying to help people understand that procurement it's not the back end of supply chain, but it's the front end of demand flow. It's the part of the business which can bring in new ideas, new suppliers, new ways of working, and so on. But it did also make me think, when I was working on that project, why is it that marketing people such as me at the time and procurement people just word speaking weren't really working together? And why were there so many of the cliches that marketing people thought of procurement as being a difficult process bound, getting in the way, slowing things down, whereas procurement people probably thought of marketing people as being spendthrift, wastrels, and people who couldn't be trusted with money. This is going back a few years. And the whole process intrigued me, and eventually I decided, wouldn't it be great if procurement people and marketing people could work more effectively together? And I eventually left Electrolux to set up my own marketing procurement consultancy. And it wasn't so much working on sort of contracting and negotiations and pricing and so on, but it was much more helping the client side of the relationship understand how agencies work and like the best ways of working with the suppliers they're working with. My view was then, and always has been, that you make it a little bit extra value in short term if you try to negotiate with your agencies or suppliers on financially. That if you understand how they work, how they make profit, what engages and motivates their people, and what it takes to help them develop their business as a result of the good work they've done for you, then you'll find that agency will give you infinitely greater value than we could possibly get by trying to cut the price. So I spent a few years running that consultancy business. I worked with Coca-Cola and Pepsi in various different areas, with McDonald's Europe, with General Motors Europe. But bit by bit, I found myself working more and more with pharma companies. And I guess that's because after the financial crash in 2007, 2008, governments, particularly European governments, had obviously put a huge amount of money into supporting their currencies and their markets. They were looking to cut costs elsewhere, and so started putting more pressure on pharmaceutical companies. Always an easy target for government, which need money, is pressure the big nasty drugs companies. I think in the 5 years to 2008, the average price of pharmaceuticals in Europe went up every year. In the 5 years after 2008, it went down every year. So pharma companies, particularly in the marketing area, needed to become much more disciplined, much more savvy about what they were spending and how they were spending it. And so I found myself working more and more for pharma companies. And then one day I had an approach from Novartis in Switzerland to go and work in as global category lead for market research and then for marketing. So moved the family to Switzerland, spent about 5 years with Novartis, working in marketing research, and then moved from Novartis to Takeda as the global procurement lead for travel, retail, and events. And from there to Bristol Myers Squibb, where I moved from having sort of vertical global roles to horizontal regional roles, covering pretty much everything that the company spent money on. And then up until the end of 2024, I was reaching leads for Canada, Latin America, Turkey, Israel, India, and most of APAC. And from there to 40 associates at the beginning of March of this year.
I want to get your kind of broad definition of what procurement is and what it means to you. And maybe as a way to start that conversation, could you describe kind of that transition from marketing services into pharma and what, the procurement job entailed? Were there, complete, I guess, analogous types of jobs that you were doing with pharma versus with a consumer packaged goods company? Were the issues similar, or was there a kind of stark difference in the kinds of procurement jobs that you were doing for pharma versus your prior work in consumer packaged goods?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that when it's being done properly, when it's being done well, I think that the basics of procurement are the same across every industry. So again, procurement, it's not the back end supply chain, but it's very much the front end of demand flow. And it's the door to the rest of the world. It's the function which can bring in new ideas and so on. And I think whichever industry you're in, it starts with having the knowledge and the insight to partner with the business. And in the case of life sciences, and this is different from consumer goods or everything else, I think the key in the pharma industry is to be able to understand the scientific and the business objectives and the strategy and the priorities. And that, I think, is the core difference. The life sciences across the piece, not just pharma, but the agricultural life sciences, does need a really good understanding of how the business works and how the science works. Because otherwise, it's difficult to know what actually constitutes value for business. So, in my case, I've been in procurement for quite some time. When I was working at BMS, I realized that maybe my commercial understanding and my cross-functional understanding wasn't everything that I would want it to be. Bristol Myers Squibb has a wonderful system called a tour of duty, which you spend 3 months or 6 months in a completely different business function, learning how things work. Just building your perspective. So I actually spent 6 months working in commercial in BMS on a project to look at re-commercializing a particular drug which had a problematic past. And I was able to work across regulatory, VAP, forecasting, finance, production, and many, many different functions. That gave me a lot more understanding of the business and science, because I had to read myself into the Journal of Transplantology, the British Journal of Nephrology, and many other publications in order to be able to understand everything else that's happening with this particular drug. So yeah, it's in any industry, it's about having the knowledge and the insight to be a credible business partner, and to understand what the science is trying to do, what business is trying to do, what its strategy is, and what its priorities are. And from that, I think you can start to identify the resources and the services that the business needs in order to deliver that strategy and achieve those objectives. And from there, you can go out to the broad external market to look at all the best possible providers, hunt for purposeful innovation which actually delivers for a business. Then obviously negotiate and contract and onboard a new supplier, get together it may be, manage the risk and the client's issues, but to do all of that in a way which means that you can build a mutually productive relationship and long-term value. And then obviously work with the stakeholders and the suppliers to maintain and to leverage those relationships for the long term. So most of those things are exactly the same for any industry. The part I think is key for life sciences is that ability to understand the science and the business of the science, because that really does dictate everything else which you try and do.
When you say the back end procurement should not be at the back end of the supply chain, are you talking about the kind of tactical, transactional role of procurement in negotiating contracts, managing technical issues and compliance versus the front end of demand flow, which I think I'm hearing you say is more relational, more holistic, gives you a sense of the top priorities of the business and how to kind of meet those requirements through procurement. Is that correct? What would you add to that?
So I think you need to have all of the end-to-end steps, and everything actually at the back end. Then the procurement processes of how do we write a contract, how do we negotiate, how do we pay people, how do we manage invoices, how do we manage cash flow. All those things are fundamentals of procurement, but they are they're far from valueless. They are critical, but they don't necessarily add value. I think for the procurement function to add value, you need to put the emphasis very much at the front end as well, and to be able to take that proactive role in understanding not just what is it that someone wants me to buy, but what is it that the business or this person, this function actually needs in order to be able to operate better and add more value for business and ultimately more value for the patient. So I think you need the backbone of procurement process and discipline and rigor and making sure that everything is done correctly, because there's a lot of compliance, a lot of regulation, and we're dealing with other people's money. But you need to add to that the scientific and business partnering to be able to drive real value all the way through the chain.
Right. Right. And, as you say, money is kind of at the root of procurement. You're spending money for services. What are some of the ways that early stage biotechs can use procurement as a strategic tool to create value? And then, we'll talk about on the flip side of that, where companies go wrong with procurement, to bad ends.
Yeah. Well, I think if you look at what actually is value for early stage biotechs, it goes far beyond cost. And obviously the money is important, but it's about balancing price and the cost of operation. If you look at the money, there are really four things which you can do. You can pay less, or you can pay smarter, or you can spend less, or you can spend smarter. And in terms of procurement managing the how much do we spend and what do we spend it on, you need to balance each of those four things. If you focus solely on how much do we pay and how can we pay less, you might get to a situation when you've managed to persuade, bully, negotiate, whatever, a supplier to doing something for less. But are they going to be a resilient supplier? Are they going to really want to do business with you? Do you run the risk of pushing the price you pay so low that you begin to damage or to erode the goodwill of that supplier working for you? So managing the money side, you've got to do it holistically and think, pay less, pay smarter, spend less, spend smarter. Balance those and you will get to a better financial outcome. But where I think I get, but where a proper functional procurement team can help is they can help anticipate and mitigate risk in the supply chain, and they can bring more operational efficiency. They can help you get to market more quickly. I think in particular, they can help you find innovative solutions and in different ways of doing things, not just different suppliers, but maybe completely different ways of meeting opportunity or solving a problem. Um, and I think you can also help the business become a customer who the most critical suppliers most want to do business with. And I think in our this increasing VUCA world that we're in, I do think that's becoming more and more important. Um, that the way I would look at it is that as the world gets more, I'll take that from that. So the nature of new pharma products is changing, and we'll see there's a big shift towards smaller disease areas and more specialist therapies. And that means that the whole R&D process is getting much more complex and much more expensive. And that in turn means that supply chains are getting much more complicated and much more expensive, in particular, much more complicated both upstream and downstream. So if downstream, if a patient has a wearable, they can actually become part of our supply chain because they can be providing data which goes to their HCP. Their HCP might then pass it back to a data agglomerator or to a pharma company, whatever. So the patient can actually become part of the entire supply chain. But what we see as a result of all of that is that the industry is becoming ever more reliant on smaller and more specialist suppliers. And so the resilience of your supply chain, particularly as an emergent biotech, becomes ever more critical because the question is, can you rely on your supplier still being there in a year's time, whatever? And as you're starting out down a long road using someone else's money, you need to be able to pick suppliers you're going to last support and who are going to want to continue working with you. Yeah. So the power then starts to shift towards the supplier. And you as a customer might begin to depend more on the supplier than they depend on you. That means that you need to be the customer who they most want to do business with. You need to position yourselves as the customer of choice.
Right.
Because you could, I think you see some great examples of this. I think the whole area of regular apologies is a great example, where there are many, many therapies coming through which have gravitated towards actinium isotopes as being, it will be the ideal isotope for medical therapies.
Right.
But there is still no reliable supply chain for the key isotopes of actinium. It is available, but many, many companies are fighting to get their share of it. If you're a customer who has habitually tried to force your supplier to take a lower price, or we keep changing your mind or messing up their workflow and their cash flow, or if you talk about orders but then don't place them, whatever field it is, if you're that kind of customer, when your supplier is under the same kind of category, political, economic, social, technological, whatever stress that you are, your supplier will become more wary. They want to concentrate on protecting their workflow, their cash flow, their profitability. They will favor the customers who they trust most. And the question moves away from it. It used to be, who do I trust as a supplier? Now I think it's becoming, who trusts me? And this is where procurement can play a key role, I think, for emerging biotechs, is because I think that companies that are better able to explore new suppliers, but then engage more effectively with them and enable those suppliers to build their business as a result, are going to get a competitive advantage because they're going to be the ones, with the customer with whom those suppliers will be most willing and most able to help when in conditions of real operational stress.
How do companies position themselves as that customer of choice, on a kind of, a very specific level? I mean, is it the individuals that are that are, negotiating the service orders, and how, that relationship evolves? Are there other things that companies can do to kind of, raise their profile with their suppliers, or endear themselves to suppliers, so that, that they are kind of, reaping the benefits of that kind of relationship?
There are a lot of things, and they all come down to, I was going to say human decency. They come down to behavior. Uh, and it's all about, treat people as you want to be treated. Um, and it's remember that even every one of your suppliers, they're people too. They're trying to run their own businesses. And if you understand what pressures your supplier is under, what is the pressures that you're under, and try to think about what would I want to do? What's going to help us build, a business relationship, which actually goes beyond mere dollars, or beyond not mere money, but actually helps us focus on not just on cost, but on service, on innovation, on to create that mutual commitment. And it comes down ultimately to looking at people as people. Um, and and I think really that's it. It's there's in what I could call less sophisticated procurement operations, you will often find that there's an absolute focus on cost. Yeah, we've got to make cost savings. We've got to get the price down. I want 10% off everything. Well, in a VUCA world, and as I'd say, sometimes in a world which has gone from VUCA to WTF, because that's the volatility of the terms that we now live in. Is it more important to have the lowest possible price? Or is it better to have a degree of sort of affordable confidence when, okay, I probably could push it if I were the supplier to a lower price, but do I want to? Because if I do, I may get some small short-term advantage. Am I really giving myself a longer term value? So again, it's think of people as people, and businesses are run by people, and start from that basis. It's I think the basis of everything successful, particularly in a world like procurement, is it's honesty, it's integrity, and it's a degree of self-awareness.
Yeah, and Tom mentioned VUCA, or the acronym for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and moving to WTF, which I probably don't need to tell this audience what that stands for. Your description of this relationship between the drug developer and suppliers, it sounds like there really needs to be a kind of give and take there, a recognition of, to your point, what the supplier needs to succeed, in addition to what, your own company needs to succeed. And it's behavioral, it's people relationships, is what you're saying. Is there anything else, I guess, that you could say about, maybe what companies specifically should think about when they're engaging a supplier? Clearly, they want to help that supplier accomplish its goals, but how do you understand what those goals are? How do you become that trusted partner that is really aligned with a dual set of objectives?
One of the great procurement acronyms is AQSCI, which has security, assurance, quality, service, cost, and innovation. So when you're starting to work with or when you're starting to look for suppliers, you would start with assurance, which is, I do my due diligence. Can I be sure that this company exists? Can I be sure about its financial history? Do any of its directors and officers have criminal records? Or all of those things. So right, first of all, I'm sure myself about the basic operating credentials of the potential supplier. Then I might look at the quality. Can they do what they say they would do? How do I know how can I measure and manage the relatively whatever output I'm looking to buy, and so on. Then I would look at the service levels of what constitutes good service to me, it's my business. What are the sensible minimum I should expect? How quickly do I expect people to pull back if I have a problem? And those are basic, hygiene factors. Only then might say, okay, if I've looked at various companies and I've weeded them out through looking at assurance, quality, and service levels, then I might look at cost. And so, okay, of the ones who meet my basic standards, which ones can give me the best price or the best value? And then as a final differentiating factor, which one's going to give me give innovation, give me something extra, which maybe some of the other ones can't. So those are the basic things which procurement should be setting out to look for. But all of that needs to be driven by a very clear understanding, what is it that my business actually needs? And that's where the partnership starts. If you have a good, if the procurement team and each different business function, they have a good relationship, if it's based on, true mutual respect and understanding, and the fact that they, my team understand what the business is in terms of science, and that we can have an intelligent conversation about the actual requirement, and maybe help give other suggestions, bring in some new ideas. If we can build that partnership, it's then much easier to build the third partnership, which is the supplier. And then ideally, you would have your business stakeholder and your procurement person and your supplier working absolutely together as a threesome. It's not different two-way relationship. You really want to have it there as a threesome, because again, that's what helps build the familiarity. It builds the trust, and it builds the willingness to go a little bit further or to offer a little bit more, either when there's an opportunity or when there's a particular issue or stress.
Right. Let's talk about early stage biopharma companies. As a company grows, naturally it needs to acquire different and new resources, different kinds of services. I could think of a situation where you have a scientific founder who maybe invented the platform technology, is in the very earliest preclinical stages of development, but now is having to hire, in preparation for clinical trials, is having to add, perhaps office space, is having to, purchase a lot of things that perhaps is a first time kind of purchase for that company. What are some of those issues, that you've encountered, in your career, or any kind of, examples that you can give where companies, should be careful about how they are managing that procurement process?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there are two big inflection points in biopharma companies' growth. The first really is moving from preclinical to clinical, and then the second, further on down the line, is moving from clinical into commercial stage. But when you look at that jump from preclinical to clinical, I mean, that's a broad term. I mean, and like you say, you suddenly need to start acquiring a whole lot of resources and services, which may be scientific, so CROs, lab space, reagents, maybe data, whatever, but also non-scientific. So suddenly you start needing employees, so you need office space, you might need cars, you need employee life assurance policies, you need primary market research, you need law firms, you need marketing agencies, you need a coffee machine, you need someone who's going to come in and change the flowers on the reception desk once every. You suddenly start needing all of these different things, which, first of all, a lot of them are complex. Most of them tend to be expensive, and almost all of them, because this is pharma land, are very much burdened by compliance and by regulation. Right. But the leadership team, like say the sort of scientific drivers of the business, seldom have very much expertise in planning spending in those areas. But very few organizations at that stage of growth have a procurement team or a procurement person who's got the depth and breadth of skills and experience either. So to negotiate for or to find someone who can change the flowers on reception desk once every couple of weeks, not so difficult. But to negotiate with the CRO, okay, there you need not just tactical expertise and negotiate by costs, but you need someone who can take a step back and take the strategic view of what we're trying to do and how will we work with this plan over the next 2 to 3 or 4, whatever number it is. And so because the early stage organizations seldom have that experience or expertise, it is very easy to start off by making mistakes, to build in indisciplined spending habits, or to waste or maybe tie up funds that should actually be supporting the clinical agenda. And it's also easy to miss opportunities for innovative approaches or for suppliers who can bring that X factor, because the overstressed leadership team, they reach for providers they know, they lots of people they've worked with in the past because they feel they can trust them. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be limiting. I was talking to a sort of mid-range stage firm weeks back at a conference with Basel in Switzerland. And they said, "Oh no, we don't have a problem with procurement because we've all done this before, and we know who we want to work with." I say, "Yes, but what about all the ones which you don't know? What could you be missing?" And again, in these increasingly lucrative times, the LTs don't have the bandwidth either to be managing currency fluctuations or worrying about their fragile supply chain or dealing with flaky suppliers or chasing unpaid invoices. Those are all disciplines which they need to be concentrated on building the business and driving the science, not on those sort of factors. And so they are really at their most exposed.
You're absolutely right. People wear a lot of hats, in early stage biotech. I could understand that, a procurement specialist may not be on staff, especially in the early days. Is it your recommendation, though, that a company that is, say, moving into clinical trials, scaling up manufacturing, making a lot of purchases, even if they're not willing to pay, a full-time salary to a procurement person, should they consider, a fractional kind of employee relationship or even, a part-time consultant? Or is it something, that a company can work through or figure out itself? I mean, I guess my question is, how do you go from this place of not knowing what you don't know to being successful, as a procurement manager at a small company that's rightly prioritizing their science, and data?
Well, I mean, obviously, as a procurement consultancy, I'm going to say they should definitely procurement too. Um, that's not the only answer. I think there's a couple of things which every firm should do when starting out, and the first is put in place some just simple but effective procurement tools. There are many different procurement digital solutions out there. They do tend to come and go pretty quickly. It's not always easy to choose the most appropriate one, but it's not necessary.
Yeah, what's your favorite tool?
Oh, very good question. I'm pretty much agnostic overall because different tools are right for different businesses. I guess the one which I have most experience of is Zip, which is a great procurement orchestration tool. A very fast growing company. There are many others, I would say, for full disclosure. But what you want is something which is no more complicated than you need it to be. And so something that just means that when you're onboarding a supplier, when you're processing invoices and payments, when you're looking at contracts and so on, you just want everything to be as simple as possible, to be in one place and to be organized. Because you do not want that Friday meeting at 5 o'clock, something has gone wrong and now we've got to source it. So just basic systems, which don't have to be expensive, don't have to be complicated, and which can be scales to match the size of your business to grow. I'd say that's an absolute fundamental. So anyone like Zip or any of the other many companies, they will help you with the implementation package, so you don't have to do that well yourself. That I think will save you in so many other ways. I mean, the other thing is just there are many areas where you simply do need a specialist person. Again, office space, you can probably negotiate that, but it's easy to tie yourself in for very long leases without quite understanding and being able to earlier in the small print work. And it's easy to commit to leasing company vehicles for longer or for more money than you need to. So you just need to take careful steps and always try to get someone to if it's an area you're well familiar with, find someone who's going to check it for. All right. And yes, that could be consultant, it could be a part-time or whatever. But that's probably going to be helping at a more tactical level. Where I think the biggest area of expense and complexity for early stage biotechs is the CRO relationship. And we all know how complex, how sensitive, how fraught, how happy those relationships can be. And yeah, that's where it is critical to understand the what am I actually procuring within this. So as the sponsor, someone in the LT or growing biotech might say, well, I've actually set up clinical trials. Yeah, I know what I'm doing. I know how to write a protocol. I know how to yeah, and we know what sort of sites we're looking for, what sort of patients we're looking for, and all of those things. Um, and they will then go and talk to a CRO. There are many different types of CRO relationships. They all have their different pros and cons and so on. So you, as a sponsor, you've got to find the right CRO and then come to the right sort of agreement with them. But I just think it's essential that you had someone with a strategic procurement background behind that. Because, okay, let's really go through openly and in detail everything that might drive cost and value for both parties in this. And it needs to be someone who is not who's not afraid to probe and to challenge both their own colleagues and the supplier, until everyone fully understands everybody else's priorities and needs and perspectives. And it means you need a lot of what ifs in there as well. What if we don't manage to hit the recruitment targets? What if we have to maybe change the protocol for some reason to the thing? What additional cost is that going to add? I think without a sort of seasoned and experienced procurement person to look at it through that dispassionate lens, and non-scientific and non-business. Okay, what do you need to really agree here? Without that, it is very easy to focus too much on price, not enough on value, and to get locked into long-term agreements that consume money without actually adding value. Ultimately, I'd say, my parents were sheep farmers, sheep and cattle farmers. One of my father's for instance, was strong fences made good neighbors. So you really need to make sure that everything is clarified. Even if people go, it's all right, I know this, I've done it before. Okay, let's write it down anyway.
Right.
Because without that, it's too easy to not latent state, but maybe not quite consider everything in the detail, which it needs to be considered in. And you're talking about multi-year relationships with many, many millions of dollars behind them. You've got to get it right. And that does mean a degree of just expertise and experience.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation the potential for locking in poor procurement practices at an early stage biotech company. And I wonder, clearly you don't want to spend any money that is unnecessary, or wasteful as a growing early stage biotech company. Managing finances is such a critical piece of operations. But what kind of impact can that have, I guess, from an investor's point of view? Is that do you risk, compounding failure, on failure by making some poor procurement decisions early on when it comes to future fundraising?
Yeah, totally. That can definitely happen. So, you're assuming you've got some funding. It could be however you've raised it. Your current funders want to see evidence that their funds are being used professionally and efficiently to drive the science and build a sound business. And they don't want to see the funds being spent on which is unnecessary or elaborate thought through. And in the same way, future investors want to see the company's been an effective steward of its previous funding and that it's likely to do so with future funding. Because I think particularly in an environment where exits got more difficult, interest rates are, higher, lower, just more volatile, then operational efficiency, if you go back a few years to more stable times, then investors would think, well, if I invest now, I'll sell out in 5 years' time. I will, if the science is right, everything will thrive in value. That's no longer the case. So I think investors more and more are looking at the operational efficiency of their investees, because that can have a big impact on future valuations, particularly in this very volatile world. some of the bigger private equity firms have sometimes quite large value creation teams, which is there to help their investees improve operation effectiveness, build their supply chains, maybe down their work on procurement as well. But they have those teams to help their investees because they see it as being an important contributor to growth and to higher future valuations. That sort of value creation team approach is, unfortunately, it's much less commonly available actually at the earlier stages of drugs. But I think it's every company really needs to think, how am I spending this next dollar? Because could this be or should this be going towards my clinical trials, or shouldn't we spend on getting myself BMW or so before?
Right. Right. I wanted to ask too about sourcing and so, if you're looking for actinium for a radiopharmaceutical, you're fairly limited, as you said, to a couple of providers they're expanding right now, but there are a number of different, sources that different kinds of biotech companies need. And I wonder, what you might say about the kind of cutting edge of procurement as it relates to sourcing. Are there different models, different innovative approaches to sourcing that you've experienced in your career, or that you see emerging at this point?
Yeah, I think there are two really interesting areas there. One is what I'd call innovative innovation. And the other, actually, which is always about to think about, is supplier diversity. So if you look at the first point, Brand, how do you look for innovation? If you always choose suppliers by going through the traditional RFI, RFP approach, reaching up to the traditional suppliers, don't be surprised if you only get the traditional answers. But there are a whole range of techniques which you can use to go far beyond the traditional supply base, and solutions that can bring you. So instead of an RFI request for information, RFP request for proposal, what are they an RFO, which is a request for outcome? I guess a way that you can think of it is sometimes you know exactly what a solution is going to look like. You know really what they're looking for. Sometimes you don't know what the solution is going to look like, and you don't necessarily care what it looks like either. Equally, sometimes you know exactly where your solution is going to come from, and sometimes you don't know or care where it's going to come from. So if you know exactly what you're looking for, and you know pretty much what sort of company it's going to come from, then just go to an RFP. Like to be let's say people, this is what I want, please give me your best price and we'll have it up. If I know pretty much where it's going to, what I'm looking for, I don't know everywhere it could come from. Okay, RFI. So I go out to a wider group of companies and I say, this is what I'm looking for. How much can you help in this area? Send me your outline, your capabilities. So now we're going to decide which one to go further. If I know what sort of supplier I'm going to be looking at, which part of the supply base an idea might come from, what solution might come from. But if I'm open to what that solution actually looks like, then let's go for an RFO. Explain your circumstances to the future supplier to say, help me solve this problem, but I'm not giving you any specific direction or on what that solution might look like. Right? I see we'll start getting broader ideas, but from the same group of suppliers. But sometimes you say, I'm trying to solve a problem. I don't know what my solution is. I don't know where it's going to come from. And so the sort of approach you can take there is open innovation. And I'll give you an example. I'll say this is from a large US pharma company. I won't name the name. But I was talking to one of the brand teams, and it's the classic conversation. But simply, what keeps you awake at night? What business problem would you really love to solve? And they said, we have a multiple sclerosis drug. One of the things we would love to be able to do is to assess cognitive performance more effectively, because cognitive performance can actually be an earlier, better indicator of progression or relapse of the disease than the usual tests of physical performance. But the problem is there have been no advances in the way that we measure cognitive performance for 20, 30, maybe 40 years. And the current tests, they're repetitive, so patients can actually learn how to do them, so they get artificially by school. They take 14 weeks to be done. You have to do in a more clinical setting and so on. So, they're not great. And so the Brandon said, wouldn't it be great if there was a way of assessing cognitive performance, which could be done by the patient themselves or maybe by their carer every day at home, take very little time to do it in a format which cannot be learned, so they can't get better at the tests by repeating them, and which would produce data which is reasonably clinically robust and can be shared with their HOP or with their specialists. But of course, there is no such solution. So we said, okay, let's see what we can do. We put that, we wrote out that problem statement, put it on an open innovation platform, or was it in the center of and we put that challenge out there to 500,000 or 600,000 people around the world who had pre-registered as solvers on the open innovation platform. And within 3 months, we had about 135 responses, of which 120 plus were completely useless and within varying degrees. Any of them were quite bad. But there were a handful which you looked at that actually that's potentially a useful idea. And we eventually drilled it down to three solutions, all of which were workable. One of the winning one, and winner won at $10,000 buying teams. The winning one, as I remember, came from a 25-year-old grad student working in a real estate firm in the US. Another came from a retired neuro consultant in Canada. And the third one was an 18-year-old Spanish student based in London. So, and each of these three solutions was completely workable. In fact, they've been developed further since. But they all came from people who were so far outside any traditional supply base that you couldn't imagine them being further. But it's just about that by taking a quite a structured but deliberately wide-ranging approach, we were able to put a problem or an issue that had not been solved or developed in decades and come up with radical workable solutions within 3 months. I know that's just one example of how if you plan it carefully, then you really can come up with genuinely distinctive and purposeful, innovative solutions.
That's a great example. I had one follow-up I wanted to ask you on requests for outcome. Is that a kind of tool that you're seeing more companies? I mean, is it a novelty at this point to send out, a request for outcome, or are more companies actually doing that at this point?
So I guess it's more common in some areas than other. In area like clinical trials, for example, it's not that common. I'm sure there are ways that it could be used. But if you look at something like marketing, then when you talk to your agency and say that I want to increase sales by 10%, or I want to increase my market share by whatever, and I don't, I'm not really sure what sort of program or campaign I'm looking at. Go away and brainstorm something and come back to that effectively is an RFO. So I'm not saying, I could say, I want a 30-second TV ad, which is going to cover the following information flows and will be broadcast on these channels at this time. Okay, that's pretty specific. But if I say, look, my target audience are 35 to 45-year-old men who drive blue cars, wear yellow shirts, and historically smoke 12 cigarettes a day. I want to get them to change their I want to sell more of that product. These are my buyers, and I want to the message I want to give them. So what is the message which I need to give them in order to make that change in behavior? How can I get that message to them? I don't know. You're the kind of marketing agency. You tell me. But in fact, that is an RFO. The skill is then taking that RFO idea and then applying it in other areas of what you do. It's never going to work for everything, and you need to know that you need to be working with suppliers who you, to some extent, already know, trust. Um, Another approach is more sort of co-development or collaboration. But again, if I've got a supplier who I know well and I trust them and I have an existing relationship with them, and I might work with them on a particular product or service. I say, let's build this together. And if it's successful, you'll obviously get paid for delivering it, and obviously, and I'll get the revenue, whatever it is. Then let's actually trust each other and work together to create something new. So it's an extension of the RFO. It's not always going to be suitable. It won't be suitable for every supplier, but it can. When the partnership is there, and when the trust is there, it can really pay dividends.
How far can you go, I wonder, in that direction? And when you were just talking, it reminded me of value-based contracts, which, some companies have started to work that essentially pay for outcomes. Like, the health insurer will pay, a certain amount if the drug takes the patient to the desired outcome, and will get rebated if the drug does not take the patient out. And I wonder to what extent that is happening, if at all, in kind of other aspects of pharma operations. For example, going to a CRO and saying, our outcome, our expected outcome is, full recruitment by this date, this number of patients, and we're going to pay you this amount of money. But if you don't reach that, if we have to delay the trial start, or you have problems with recruitment, then we get down to this next payment. Similarly with marketing services, I don't know what the metrics would be, but it could be, a certain number of doctors are prescribing within a certain amount, whatever it is. Have you seen any of that kind? Has it gone to kind of that extent in procurement in terms of the supplier having some skin in the game?
Yes, sure. And it's more common in some areas than others. And it's known as pain share, gain share, or bonus as malus.
Okay.
The the problems are, and this is where I think it's a particular problem in life sciences, in biotech. That's because there are so many potential variables. So if you can link the outcome directly to the supplier's performance, then great. They performed super well, they get bonus. They fail to perform, then they get some kind of clawback. But there are so many potential factors that could have an impact. So the supplier could perform wonderfully, but the drug sales aren't what you want because a competitor came out, because there was a new piece of data from another company. It could mean that there was a supply chain problem, which meant that there wasn't enough product available. It could be that the sales force didn't get adequate reach. I mean, if there are any one of many, many different factors could either either genuinely or just by claim enable the supplier to say, well, I took my part, and the reason that the performance wasn't what was expected, it wasn't my fault, it was due to whatever other factors. So where you can genuinely cut out all those other factors and say there is a causative relationship between input and performance, yeah, sure, that's perfectly workable, and you see it. If there are other factors, which are just uncontrollable or unpredictable variables, it's going to be it will be more difficult. And I think that you see a lot of that in drug pricing. I mean, we can now look at some examples of drug pricing. We get take the drug, we get better, fact with more money, or even say prescribe the drug. If you reimburse the drug, and the patient gets better, pay me at the end, or pay me not 6 months if the patient is still alive, or whatever it might be. It was the patient's kidney function continues to do this, you pay me. If it changes, you stop paying it. But whatever the rate might be. If you can really pin down absolutely clear links of cause and effect, great. But it is just so difficult to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's why there was initially a lot of excitement about these value-based contracts, risk-based contracts. And they didn't become as popular as I think, people initially expected because of that, because of that complexity, comorbidities, lifestyle, all sorts of inputs into the outcome that a drug can deliver that may not be able to be easily accounted for, in a contract, right?
Yeah. But I do believe that data is always going to get bigger, but as our ability to process and first of all to accumulate and analyze data and then disaggregate it, that is growing and growing, growing every day. And I do think that we will get to the point when it does become increasingly possible to link, cause and effects, despite the many variables in the background.
Great. Well, we are running short on time here, Tom, but I want to give you just a chance before we wrap up. If there's any last, kind of final thoughts that you have on this topic that maybe you think are important that we haven't discussed, perhaps any advice you might have to biotech builders, working in a WTF world at the moment where there's a lot of uncertainty just, in terms of global economic policy, various conflicts around the world. What are your final thoughts in terms of what early stage and mid stage biotech companies can do to kind of stay on the right foot with procurement, or even use it to their advantage?
There are some letters I would highlight, and they're not VUCA and they're not WTF. What I would always try and highlight is that in the middle of the word procurement are the four letters CURE. And I always do highlight them, have them on my email signature picked out in a different font color. So because I think the message, both for procurement people, but also for early stage biotechs, is remember that if you enable and encourage your procurement team or procurement partner to be the best they can and to do the job that they can do, when the sourcing and procurement functions are operating at its best, we really can have as direct an impact on the patient as any other part of the function. And so I believe that the cure or cure is or should always be at the heart of what procurement does. So engage us early, engage us deeply, trust us, let us be part of your business. Trust that we do have, hopefully we have the scientific understanding and the business savvy to be able to contribute as your strategic partner, as well as your commercial backbone. Involve us in that way, and we will genuinely help you deliver a level of lasting value, which you won't be able to find from any other way.
Excellent. Tom, thank you so much for being here today. It was an education for me, and I expect it will be for many of our listeners. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Pete.
We've been speaking with Tom Wells, Director of Life Sciences at 4C Associates. I'm Ben Comer, and you've just listened to the Business of Biotech. Find us and subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts, and be sure to check out new weekly videocasts of these conversations every Monday under the Business of Biotech tab at Life Science Leader. We'll see you next week, and thanks for listening.